wa Turkana wameamua kuachilia mafuta hii. Tumekuwa na amani vile tulianza kwa ile trucks, mpaka sasa tumepata 200,000 barrels. Na hiyo Mturkana anahesabu hizo trucks ikipita. Moja imepita ni kama mbuzi moja ikipita anasema hiyo moja, mpaka 200,000 barrels. Na kwa kimila ya Kiturkana, mtukufu rais, wakati unachinja mbuzi, wakati unachinjia rafiki ama mgeni mbuzi, mwenye mbuzi anabaki na mguu. Mwenye anachinjiwa mbuzi anaenda na ile area nyingine na pia na kichwa ndio ajue ni mbuzi. Sasa wasee wa Turkana pamoja na vijana wameniambia kwa hii mafuta ya EOPS, hiyo kamuguu tungetaka kupata.
Now, Kenya made her maiden oil export to the international market, joining the League of Oil Exporting Countries, a move President Uhuru Kenyatta described as a major milestone for the country as he flagged off 200,000 barrels of crude oil from the port of Mombasa. Now, a consignment that fetched Kenya a total of 1.2 billion shillings, the oil trucked by road hundreds of kilometers from up north into Turkana oil fields. So various leaders from associated counties asked for a revenue share of the black gold. But even with these latest developments, pertinent questions as to the country's preparedness for this venture still linger. And so tonight, we bring various experts and stakeholders for a holistic conversation on this precious commodity. I will be speaking to Patrick Obath, the former CEO of Shell and an expert on matters petroleum. He will be joining us from our city center studios. Changamwe Member of Parliament Omar Mwinyi, whose constituency hosts the Changamwe Refinery that was used for stockpiling of the crude oil, will also be joining us from our studios in Mombasa, as well as the CEC for Water, Environment and Natural Resources in Turkana County, Mr. Emathe Namuar, who will be speaking to us on phone during the broadcast. Good evening. This is a big story, and my name is Akisa Wandera. Let's begin with our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna.
So yesterday marked Kenya's first export of crude oil, 200,000 barrels of crude oil to be precise. And to talk a little bit more about what all this portends going forward, because we had from the leaders and governors from the various counties talking about how they were desirous of reaping from this new venture, from talking about this being an animal, and so they want to share out the neck, the ribs, the leg, the skin, you name it. What does this mean for Kenya's economy? Is it major? Is it going to make a difference for the country's growth going forward? I have with me this evening Adero Okudo. She is an energy economist, also the managing partner of Catalyst Capital Advisors. Thank you so much for making time for us. So let's begin with that. This has been a long journey. Before we saw the export yesterday, 7 years in the making, from discovery to now export of these 200,000 barrels of oil. For you, looking back at the journey that Kenya has taken, how would you describe it? Because a lot of standoff, whether it's between the county governments and the local government and the national government. There's investors that are involved. But what all this portends, that year, those years that we've seen past, what they have meant for you?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I'll start by saying that this is such a remarkable moment for Kenya. It really is a moment that every Kenyan should be proud of. And the journey has been long. Oil exploration in Kenya started in the 1930s. And since then, all these many years later, to be just exporting our first, few barrels of crude oil is such a momentous occasion. Tullow started exploring for oil in Turkana in 2012. And that was the same year the discovery was announced. And it's taken 7 years of, drilling, testing, and finding a market for our oil.
Yeah.
So it's a huge and momentous occasion for Kenya.
Yeah, so we have had the various stakeholders, the leadership, the locals, talking about what it is they hope this will mean for them. So from an energy economist perspective, is this significant? We know countries like Nigeria and other big oil producers, how big of a difference it makes. So should Kenya, even as much as this is the first time, there's so much more work to be done, is it significant in your view?
It's a significant achievement for us to be exporting the first few barrels. At the same time, this is part of the early oil pilot scheme, pilot being the key word. It's still a pilot project. Kenya is still not a commercial oil exporting a country. That's a journey that the government projects will, take us up until 2022 to achieve. And so in the meantime, while we should be, quite thrilled that we've exported the first few barrels, we need to, manage expectations. There's so many critical things that need to happen between now and full commercial exporting status.
Yeah. But in as far as sharing, because you have investors like Tallow and others coming in with the exploration and the drilling and all the work that goes into it, so that before we're talking about even what the revenue shareable between the national government and the county governments, there's already money going to the principal investors. So is it going to be going forward significant? So, for instance, from the 1.2 billion shillings from this 200,000 barrels, do we have an indication even how much, for instance, would be talking going to the county governments and the national government?
At this point, it really is impossible to tell. In March this year, the Petroleum Act was enacted, and it stipulates that 75% of this profit would go to the central government, 20% to the county governments, and another 5% to be shared amongst the community. So that's clear. However, what's not clear in the bill and is yet to be communicated by the joint venture partners or the government is how the cost of the early oil pilot scheme is going to be divided between the government as well as the partners. So until we know how much the project has costed and which parties are going to be accountable for which costs, it'll be impossible to know how much revenue is going to end up within the counties and communities.
Because on the other hand, Kenya is a net importer. So here we are talking about exporting these 200,000 barrels of oil. And one of the key questions that has come out is, why are we exporting it? Why not use it? What's Kenya's consumption vis-a-vis now what we're exporting? Doesn't it work better to use the oil locally? So break down for us how this works.
Right. So there's been quite a bit of commentary about this. Kenyans were excited with the news that, yay, we're going to export our first few barrels. But at the same time, many Kenyans have been disappointed that we are not refining the oil locally and have questioned why does that value addition take place elsewhere if we're a net importer of oil. And I happen to agree with, the government's position on this one. I think the president touched on this in his remarks, and the PS has also been very vocal about the fact that Kenyan oil is still not financially viable enough to justify a local refinery. We do have the Changamwe refinery in Mombasa, but it needs approximately 1.2 billion shillings worth of upgrading work for it to be operational again. The government has indicated that, a refinery, for it to do well competitively, you would need to be processing about 400,000 barrels of oil. And with our discoveries at this point, there's capacity for about 80,000 barrels per day. So we're still well below what it would take to justify refining locally.
Yeah. But that even Changamwe now is not operational. Was it as a result of neglect? Is it because there wasn't much going on there? Because you have the petroleum board as well in place working, but people wondering what do they do if we are not refining oil, and other stakeholders. So in your view, and when you look at this, is it that it was neglected and so got old, damaged, and so that the work would be so much to put into it to make it work? Or is it the kind of oil that we're now producing and have discovered vis-a-vis the capacity at the refinery?
Well, it's a combination of all of those things that you've mentioned. Yes, I do agree that, the Changamwe oil refinery has been neglected. This is something that really should have been maintained throughout the years. And I think that so much of what's happening within Kenya's economic development as a whole, so many industries are being developed in isolation, whereas Vision 2030, paints this framework where industries should be compatible with one another. And it would be good to see that coordination happening within government as well, so that things are working as they should, and our industries are complementing each other.
So back to the question of what this, in as far as our economy portends. Agriculture is what our backbone is for Kenya's economy. But with all the excitement, is it hullabaloo? Is it all this over nothing, to the extent that can this make a significant difference? So when we hear the fields now have about 560 million barrels, if we are able to fully drill and export our potential as a country, is that significant enough for Kenya to be a big player in the oil market?
Well, 560,000 barrels is significant, but I don't think that Kenyans are quite yet going to feel huge, enormous economic benefit until the entire value chain of this oil process is localized. Because then, one of the resulting benefits would be job creation. But so much of the value chain still remains with huge gaps and will require international partners to fulfill. The maritime industry, for example, the barrels that we shipped yesterday were not on a Kenyan ship. That would have been great because that would entail so much more job creation for Kenyans. And so while it is significant, I think that there's still a lot to be done by the government in terms of developing the value chain so that Kenyans really can feel the benefits of this development.
And when those people who see the downside of what oil can do to a country like Nigeria, whether it's now the fight for those resources and benefits, we've already seen some of those standoffs, not of course degenerating to that level, but the concern that it could end up being a good thing turned bad. Is that something Kenya should be worried about? And if so, what should she do?
Absolutely. We've seen in Nigeria and we've seen in other parts of the world that oil development is a very, very sensitive process. There's diverse stakeholders and they each have different priorities. And I think that the Kenyan government is doing a pretty good job so far in terms of managing expectations. We heard it repeatedly throughout President Kenyatta's speech yesterday that, the oil is not Turkana's oil. This is, a national treasure that belongs to all Kenyan people and should be used equitably amongst all Kenyans. So I think that there's so far there's been very good management of expectations. The most critical thing, of course, will be effective and efficient management of the entire process to make sure that every stakeholder is satisfied and to make sure that Kenyans are really receiving the value for the oil.
And finally, to the question around climate change and that the world is moving more towards renewable energy. So is this a step back? How do we make sure that gains are made as we still exploit potential in as far as what we have as resources in the country?
That's a great question. Yes, this is an interesting time. The world is moving towards renewables. Here in Africa, definitely in Kenya, we're a little further back in terms of our industrial development progress. And so I think that oil is a good thing. We're also doing very well in terms of renewable power generation, but oil production is a good complement. It will help to, create employment. It'll help to boost economic welfare of Kenya. And eventually, this is most important because it'll help develop industries. And I think that that's the main goal of Vision 2030 for us to develop our industries.
So in terms of climate change, we're not going off the mark?
We're not going off the mark. I know that we have signed international obligations. We are signatories of COP21. which gives us our climate change targets. And Kenya has complied so far. You know, many westernized nations have had their time to industrialize, and now is ours. And we have to do it, you know, most affordably.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Adero Okudo with us here on The Big Story. So definitely a long way to go. 7 years it has taken for Kenya to get to this point, exporting that crude oil just yesterday. And of course, you could feel the excitement from the leaders and the governors, especially from the various counties that were gathered in that flag-off event in Mombasa County. You have the leaders from West Pokot, the governor there, also saying, in fact, after Turkana, West Pokot is perhaps where the government will be looking next to also consider the fields there and the potential there is in as far as oil is concerned. But for the people in Turkana, reminding again the president that because it's coming from us, we must feel and have the benefits, reap the benefits, if you like, of this. So definitely a conversation that will continue in coming days to see how all of this is structured so that on one hand, every Kenyan, as the president was insisting, it's not oil for one particular region. It may come from there, but that it's a national resource. But of course, from where these people are coming from, that extra benefit always goes a long way to ensure we do not see the kinds of events we saw with strikes and interfering with the work of the drilling and investing partners in those regions, because then at the end of the day, that interferes and interrupts the entire process. Back to you, Akesa.
Main tank for the all oil in Kenya is found around Orua, which is found in West Pokot County. So just consume the little you have up there in Lokijar. But the main one is just at the foot of the mountains where you are coming to do it next. What I want us to do, watu wameomba hapa miguu, wameomba mbavu, maini ya Kwale yatachukuliwa, sisi tutaka shingo tu. And I want to explain to you how we can get that shingo bila kumuumiza mtu wa Turkana ama mwingine. Your Excellency, this constituency here called Changamwe for long has hosted the oil refinery. Sisi we believe katika hali ya uchumi, you have to find a way continuously to diversify the economy. We cannot stay stagnant. Hatuwezi kukalia pahali pamoja. Kile kitu mimi nataka, chukueni mafuta huko, sisi tutengeneze hapa a trading hub and petrochemical industry for value addition, because the port of Mombasa is here.
Well, some of the views there by the leaders who were at the event yesterday as President Uhuru Kenyatta flagged off the 200,000 barrels of crude oil from the port of Mombasa to Malaysia, a venture that is expected to fetch Kenya 1.2 billion Kenya shillings under the early oil early oil pilot scheme. And of course, we will be just taking a look at what then does this mean for the country. Once again, to reintroduce my guest in studio, Mr. Patrick Obath is joining us live from our City Center studios. He's a former CEO of Shell and of course quite an expert in matters petroleum. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And of course we have Member of Parliament Changamwe Omar Mwinyi, whose constituency hosts the Changamwe refinery that was used to stockpile the crude oil before it was exported. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight on The Big Story. I think I'll start with you, Mr. Obath, being quite versed with matters petroleum and issues around it. From what Okudo, just picking up from where Okudo has left, says that we really need to manage expectations as far as what this will mean for the economy means. Do you think, or how much do you think we stand to gain from this venture?
I think the first thing is that this was an early oil pilot scheme. And the objective of the pilot scheme was primarily to ensure that we can actually get oil to the market, get it processed, and once it has been processed, we will then know the real value and the convertibility of that crude oil into good value products. The next thing that needs to happen is that as we begin to export under this EOPS scheme, the first cost that has to be recovered is what is called cost oil. The investors or the explorers who have done the work to find the oil have actually borrowed money to do that. So they're paying interest, they've got all the banks, they've got all the other people who have given the money who are waiting to be paid back, and for each day that they're not paid back, they're accruing interest, maybe at a very low interest rate, but they're accruing it. So the first thing that has to happen is that most of the money that is coming out of the early oil scheme is basically going to be used to pay back the cost of exploring and bringing the oil to the market. Only a very small percentage of that will come into the government in terms of tax and stuff like that. And it may take several years before we begin to tail off on paying off the cost oil, which is the cost of exploration plus the cost of getting it to market now, before we now begin to see dividends coming into the economy.
So what?
So I think that conversation needs to be had so that people understand.
So what you really mean is we are not going to expect anything in our economy as far as this is concerned yet?
Not to the extent that people will be excited to see the impact of oil. It will still be the same as it is now, whereby you're getting employment, you're getting people buying facilities and so forth. But in terms of getting oil money back into the economy, that will take quite a bit of time.
Let's talk about the systems that have been put in place, if at all there's any. This is a new venture for the country. The president seemed very positive about it. But do you think, in terms of preparedness with systems in place, maybe even tabling the Kenya Sovereign Wealth Fund bill that the National Treasury is expected to table to Parliament, they haven't done this yet, which they should have given this kind of resource. Do you think we are prepared for this? What do we need to put in place?
I think the legislation that currently exists is sufficient to take care of the current situation of play. So in terms of defining the revenue sharing, that is already there. The issue of the community development agreements, that has already been done. And then also the whole relationship between the investors and the government and the communities, all that is done. The next thing that really needs to happen is that there needs to be a very clear definition of how the revenues that are going to accrue, maybe in about 3 or 4 years' time, when that revenue begins to accrue, how is it going to be spent so that it's not just spent like you'd normally go and spend money on leisure. It is spent on investing in sustainable activities that once the oil is finished, in maybe about 20 years, the areas that the oil has been found will have a sustainable economic activity beyond oil. And I think that conversation has not happened, and that needs to happen very quickly.
There's also the conversation, just before I go to Honorable Mwinyi, there's a conversation that the government now wants to build a pipeline from Lokichar to Lamu, given, of course, these latest developments. There are some experts who argue that it would be cheaper to, use the road network that we have used this time. Where do you stand on this issue?
The road network is basically not possible. How long has it taken us to get 200,000 barrels? It's going to take a long time. We're only producing 2,000 barrels a day at the moment. When we get full production, which is 80,000 barrels a day, road transportation is out of the question. So we have to develop the pipeline from Lokichar to Lamu and develop proper export facilities there so that at least we are not going to damage our roads. We are able to ramp up production to the maximum amount so that we get to the point whereby we are able to share revenue much earlier. If you go by road, it's going to take maybe another 8-10 years before you get there.
Let's now bring in Honorable Mwinyi joining us live from our Mombasa studios. Omar Mwinyi is a member of Parliament. Changamwe, thank you for joining us here tonight. Let's maybe just start with some of the expectations for this, given that the launch was just yesterday in your county. What are the expectations from your constituency, given that it houses the Changamwe Refinery?
One thing about the people of Changamwe, they've always hold their refinery in esteem, and it was actually a hope for many that employment opportunities will be there in terms of experts and the less skilled to be employed. At the same time, supporting the industries which are dependent on the refinery. This was actually the hope that perhaps the government would resign its decision to stop it from functioning. And as per the advice that we got from the interministerial committee that was formed by the government to look into this idea whether the refinery would be prudent to be upgraded or maybe shut and maybe a new one built in its place. We understand that the finding that were given at that time was we required about $2.5 billion to revamp the refinery, upgrade it, so that it can be manufacturing more byproducts of crude oil. And maybe to put up a new one, we would actually require about $7 billion US. So by that extension, you would imagine perhaps this would have been more cheaper for us to revamp the refinery, make it, of course, give people of Mombasa and Kenya, of course, hope. And it would also be serving the whole of this region, because in the whole region, the refinery that is actually running is South Africa. And we were thinking maybe we would have actually tapped our oil production from Turkana and the oil coming from Uganda, which of course lands at Tanga. All combined, it would have made our refinery here in Mombasa very busy. And our expectations are that we would have been in a position to produce more byproducts, including bitumen, which is used in construction of our roads. Would not be importing any more bitumen, and would also be producing more byproducts like the ones that we use for making plastics, making Vaseline, petroleum jellies, and all these things. And definitely it would have created more jobs for our people, and it would even have opened up more industries, which of course will require at this point in time. All the governments are now trying to throw their weight behind job production, because this is the challenge that all the governments are facing.
That these expectations haven't quite been met. All that the refinery has been used for is, to just stockpile that crude oil. There seemed, from what you say, to be a lot of expectations from locals that this will bring back the vibrancy of that particular refinery. So then what? What are the sentiments on the ground currently after what was said by the president yesterday and the activities that followed?
Yeah, in fact, we have agreed as members of parliament and communities of Mombasa and coast at large that we should be meeting the president when he comes up from Japan, so that we may give some of these sentiments to him for his government to consider, because the recommendations from the interministerial committee was that an investor be found who can pump in some money to revive the refinery. And I understand there were 3 who were recommended, and all was set for that. But then I don't know what happened. This decision was rescinded, and perhaps we hope now, maybe with this production of oil from Turkana, we may have a change of heart from the government, and maybe some activities will be seen to be to be done here at Changamwe, which would again revamp the hopes, because as we speak, so many industries that were dependent on the refinery have actually died, including the banking industry, which was also benefiting from this business, oil business transactions. They have also suffered some business losses. So we believe the government may reconsider after we sit we sit and air our views to the effect that the death of the refinery means the death of so many livelihoods and jobs, of course, opportunities.
All right.
And that is actually our concern at the moment as leaders.
Okay. All right. Honorable Mwinyi, the Member of Parliament, Changamwe, saying they will be seeking an audience with the President when he comes back from Japan on some of the concerns from residents in Changamwe. I want us to take a quick break. We're still on the big story. If you have any questions, do ask. Tweet us at Akisondera, at KTN News KE. A lot of conversation I'm seeing online concerning this EOPS, and of course we'll be getting some of the concerns and questions. Let's take that break. Stay with us.